The winter wind howled across the Kansas prairie like a wounded beast, carrying with it the bite of December frost and the promise of harder days to come. The tall grass, once golden in summer's embrace, now stood brittle and gray, bending before each gust in waves that stretched to the horizon. Against this desolate canvas, a small log cabin sat hunched like a forgotten prayer, its weathered walls the only barrier between civilization and the vast emptiness of the frontier. Inside, Sarah McKenna pressed her palm against the frosted window pane, her breath fogging the glass as she peered into the gathering dusk. 22 years old and 3 months a widow, she still caught herself listening for the familiar sound of boots on the porch, the cheerful whistle that had always announced Thomas's return from the fields. But the only sounds now were the wind's mournful song and the settling of logs in the dying fire. The consumption had taken him quickly that autumn, reducing her strong, unlaughing husband to a shadow before the first snow fell. The neighbors had helped her bury him behind the barn, beneath the cottonwood tree where they'd shared their first kiss 5 years prior. Since then, the visits had grown fewer, the helpful hands withdrawn. A young widow alone on the prairie was a curiosity at best, a scandal at worst, and the good people of Cedar Ridge kept their distance, whispering behind gloved hands whenever she ventured to town for supplies. Sarah turned from the window, her worn calico dress rustling as she moved to stoke the fire. The woodpile was running low, another task Thomas would have seen to, another reminder of his absence. She'd learned to split logs herself, her soft hands growing calloused. But winter demanded more than she could provide alone. The larder held only cornmeal, a few preserved vegetables, and strips of dried beef that would need to last until spring. As she reached for the poker, the sound of horses made her freeze. Multiple horses, moving fast across the frozen ground. Her heart quickened. Travelers sometimes passed through, but they followed the main road a mile south. These riders were coming directly toward the cabin. Sarah moved quickly to the mantel, where Thomas's old Colt Navy revolver rested in its holster. Her fingers trembled as she checked the chambers, loaded, though she'd only fired it once, under Thomas's patient instruction. Through the thin walls, she could hear the horses slowing, men's voices carrying on the wind, rough and unfamiliar. Smoke from the chimney. Jake, someone's home. Widow McKenna, like they said in town. All alone out here. Sarah's blood ran cold. She recognized neither voice, but their tone held a casual menace that raised the hair on her neck. She backed away from the door, the revolver heavy in her grip. As boots thudded onto the porch, the knock, when it came, was more of a pounding that shook the door in its frame. "Open up, ma'am. We're just travelers seeking shelter from the cold." She knew better than to believe them. Honest travelers announced themselves from a distance, approached slowly. These men had surrounded her home like wolves circling wounded prey. "The town's 5 miles east," she called, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Murphy's boarding house has rooms." Harsh laughter answered her. "Now that's not very Christian of you, ma'am. The good book says to show hospitality to strangers. The good book also says the devil comes in pleasing disguises. Move along." The silence that followed was worse than threats would have been. Sarah gripped the revolver tighter, though she knew she couldn't hold off multiple men if they decided to force their way in. The cabin had only one door, 2 windows. Thomas had always meant to cut a back entrance, but never found the time. Then came the sound she dreaded, splintering wood as something heavy struck the door. Once, twice, and on the third blow the bar cracked, the door bursting inward in a shower of splinters and cold air. 3 men pushed inside, bringing the smell of whiskey, sweat, and trail dust. The leader, a bearded man with cold gray eyes, spotted the gun in her hands and smiled. Now, little lady, that's no way to greet guests." Sarah raised the Colt, but her hands shook visibly. "Get out of my home." "Your home?" The bearded man looked around the sparse cabin with mock interest. "Seems a bit much for one small woman. Where's that husband of yours?" "Oh, that's right." His smile widened. "Dead and buried, isn't he? Left you all alone with whatever coin he'd saved." Where is it? Widow? There's no money. We were farmers, not bankers. Every farmer has something tucked away. The second man, thin and hawk-faced, began opening cupboards, dumping their contents onto the floor. Could be we'll have to persuade you to remember where. The third man, younger than the others with nervous, darting eyes, had circled behind her. Sarah spun, trying to keep all three in sight, but it was hopeless. The bearded man lunged forward, his hand closing over her wrist with crushing force. The gun fell, clattering across the floor. No! Sarah fought with desperate strength, clawing at his face, but the men were too strong. Too many. The thin one produced a length of rough rope from his saddlebag, and despite her struggles, they forced her into a chair, binding her wrists behind her back. The rope bit into her skin, tight enough to make her fingers tingle. She's a fighter. Jake, the young one said, breathing hard. Maybe we should find what we came for. Jake, the bearded leader, cut him off, but his eyes lingered on Sarah in a way that made her stomach turn. Plenty of time to decide what to do with her after. Sarah tried to speak, to reason with them, but the thin man had found a dirty neckerchief in his pocket. He forced it between her teeth, tying it tightly behind her head. The taste of trail dust and sweat made her gag, but the cloth muffled her protests to whimpers. She could barely breathe through the thick fabric, panic rising in her chest as the men ransacked her home. They overturned the bed, emptied drawers, even pried up floorboards. The wedding photograph of her and Thomas was trampled underfoot, the glass cracking. Her few precious books were tossed into the fire. All the while, Jake watched her with those cold eyes, occasionally asking where the money was hidden. Each time she shook her head, he seemed almost pleased, as if her resistance gave him something to look forward to. Nothing here but woman's things and old clothes, the thin man finally announced, disgust in his voice. Check the barn, Jake ordered. Farmers love hiding things in barns. As two of them headed outside, Jake pulled up a chair across from Sarah. The fire cast dancing shadows across his weathered face as he studied her. You know what I think? I think you're telling the truth. No money here, but that doesn't mean the trip was wasted. Sarah's eyes widened as his meaning became clear. She pulled against the ropes, the chair creaking, but they held fast. Her muffled sounds of distress only seemed to amuse him. Pretty young thing like you, all alone. Town folks said you haven't taken up with anyone since your man died. Must get lonely, cold nights like this. He reached out, and Sarah jerked her head back, but he only tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with mock gentleness. Don't worry, we'll keep you company for a while. The other men returned, empty-handed and frustrated. Nothing in the barn but an old plow horse and some chickens. Jake stood, his decision made. Then we take what we can. Food. Whatever valuables she's got. As for her... He glanced back at Sarah. We'll decide that after we've eaten. I'm thinking she might know more than she's saying. Just needs the right encouragement. They made themselves at home, eating her food, drinking Thomas's hidden flask of whiskey. Sarah sat bound and gagged in the corner, watching them destroy her sanctuary. The ropes had numbed her hands. The gag made each breath a struggle. But worse than the physical discomfort was the fear of what would come when they finished their meal. She thought of Thomas, of the life they'd built together in this little cabin. Sunday dinners, quiet evenings by the fire, plans for children who would never be born. All of it ending here, with rough men and rougher intentions. She closed her eyes, trying to find some reserve of strength, some hope to cling to. The wind continued its lonely howl outside, and Sarah had never felt more abandoned by God and man alike. In the flickering firelight, she began to pray, not for rescue, which seemed impossible, but for the courage to face whatever came next with dignity. The gag stole her words. But perhaps, she thought desperately, heaven could hear the prayers of the heart. The sky burned crimson and gold as Matthew Garrett guided his bay mare across the endless prairie, the December sun hanging low like a dying ember. He'd been riding since dawn, following no particular trail, just the restless pull that had governed his life these past 5 years. The scent of sage and frost filled his lungs, mixing with the familiar smell of leather and horse sweat that had become his constant companions. At 31, Matthew had the weathered look of a man who'd seen both ends of the frontier and found neither to his liking. His brown hair hung past his collar, his jaw shadowed with several days' growth. The badge he'd once worn with pride lay buried in his saddlebags, a reminder of the life he'd left behind in Abilene. These days, he answered to no one, drifting from town to town, picking up work where he could, breaking horses, riding herd, whatever kept him moving. The mare snorted, her breath clouding in the cold air, and Matthew patted her neck absently. "Easy, Belle. We'll find somewhere to bed down soon." As if in answer to his words, he spotted smoke rising in the distance, a thin gray line against the darkening sky. A homestead? By the look of it, Matthew hesitated. He generally avoided settlers, preferring to make camp under the stars rather than impose on families scratching out their hard living from the unforgiving land. But something about the scene troubled him. The smoke seemed too thin for a cooking fire on a cold evening, and as he drew closer, he noticed horses tied hastily to the porch rail, their saddles still on. His hand moved instinctively to the colt at his hip, a gesture born of too many years wearing a star. 3 horses, all showing signs of hard riding. No farmer would leave good horses standing saddled in this cold. Matthew dismounted 100 yards out, looping Belle's reins around a fence post. Whatever was happening in that cabin, he'd rather approach on foot. The wind carried men's laughter as he moved closer, harsh, drunken sounds that raised his hackles. Through the window, he could see figures moving about, and something else that made his jaw tighten. A woman, tied to a chair in the corner, a gag cutting cruelly across her face. Even from this distance, he could see the fear in her posture, the way she held herself rigid despite her bonds. Matthew had seen enough. He'd walked away from the law, but some things a man couldn't ignore and still call himself human. Moving silent as smoke, he circled to the door, which hung crooked on its hinges, clearly forced. Inside, 3 men were helping themselves to what looked like the last of the household's food, passing a flask between them. "I say we take her with us," the youngest was saying. "Sell her in Mexico. Pretty white woman would fetch good money. Too much trouble," another answered. "But we could have some fun before we go." The bearded one, clearly the leader, held up a hand. "All in good time. Boys, let her stew a bit longer. Fear makes them more cooperative." Matthew had heard enough. He stepped through the doorway, his boots announcing his presence on the wooden floor. "Evening, gentlemen." All 3 spun toward him, hands reaching for weapons. Matthew stood relaxed, his hand resting easy near his gun butt. "Seems like you boys have had your fill of hospitality. Time to move along." The bearded man, Jake, Matthew would later learn, recovered first, his eyes narrowing as he took in the newcomer's travel-worn appearance. "This ain't your concern, drifter. Best keep riding." "Made it my concern when I rode up." Matthew's voice stayed conversational, but his eyes had gone cold as winter stone. "The lady seems uncomfortable with your company." "Lady?" Jake laughed. "Just a widow woman, all alone. We're doing her a favor, keeping her company." Matthew's gaze flicked to the woman. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe early 20s, with auburn hair coming loose from its pins and green eyes wide with desperate hope above the gag. The ropes had left angry marks on her wrists where she'd struggled. "Doesn't look like she's enjoying the conversation much." He addressed the men again. "Here's what's going to happen. You boys are going to walk out that door, get on your horses, and ride. You're going to do it now, and you're going to do it peaceful-like." The thin man snorted. 3 against 1. Saddle tramp. You figuring to be some kind of hero?" "No heroes here," Matthew replied quietly. "Just a man who's awful tired and looking forward to making camp. You're between me and a peaceful evening." Jake studied him more carefully now, noting the tied-down holster. The easy stance of a man comfortable with violence, You got the look of a lawman about you. Not anymore. The truth of it still stung, even after all these years. But I remember how it's done. A heartbeat of silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Jake made his move, going for his gun with practiced speed. He was fast, but Matthew was faster. 5 years of staying alive on the frontier compressed into a single fluid motion. His Colt cleared leather and spoke once, the sound enormous in the small cabin. Jake's gun flew from his hand as he clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. The other two froze, hands halfway to their weapons. Next one goes center mass, Matthew said calmly. Your choice, boys. The younger man's nerve broke first. He backed toward the door, hands raised. We're going, mister, we're going. The thin one helped Jake to his feet, the leader cursing steadily as blood dripped onto the floor. This ain't over, he snarled. I'll remember you. You do that. Matthew kept his gun level as they stumbled outside. He followed them to the porch, watching as they mounted clumsily. Jake needing help into his saddle. Only when the sound of hoofbeats faded into the darkness did he holster his weapon and turn back inside. The woman sat exactly as before, but tears now tracked down her cheeks. Matthew approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her further. Easy now, ma'am, they're gone. He pulled out his knife, and she flinched. Just going to cut these ropes. The blade sliced through the bonds easily, and she gasped as circulation returned to her hands. Matthew moved around front, reaching for the gag. This might hurt some. They tied it awful tight. As gently as he could, he worked the knot loose and pulled the foul cloth away. She drew in a shuddering breath, then another, her whole body trembling. I thought I was going to suffocate, she whispered, her voice raw. I thought no one would come. Well, someone did. Matthew stepped back, giving her space. You hurt anywhere else, ma'am? She shook her head, rubbing her wrists where the rope had left marks. Just these, and my pride, I suppose. A bitter laugh escaped her. Widow less than a season, and already I can't protect myself. 3 armed men would be a challenge for anyone. He glanced around the ransacked cabin. They take anything valuable? There wasn't much to take. Some food, my husband's watch. Her voice caught. They destroyed more than they stole. Matthew righted an overturned chair and began picking up scattered belongings. A photograph with cracked glass caught his eye. A young couple on their wedding day. The woman before him recognizable despite her current dishevelment. Thank you, she said suddenly. I don't even know your name. Matthew Garrett. He set the photograph carefully on the mantel. And you? Sarah McKenna. She stood unsteadily, smoothing her torn dress. I should offer you supper, but they ate what little I had. I've got supplies in my saddlebags. Why don't you sit while I fetch them? You've had a shock. Outside. Belle waited patiently where he'd left her. Matthew gathered his things, including coffee and hardtack, and led the mare to the small barn. As he unsaddled her, he noticed how well kept the structure was despite the widow's circumstances. Someone had cared about this place once. Back in the cabin, he found Sarah trying to sweep up broken crockery with shaking hands. Let me, he said, taking the broom. You make coffee if you're able. Always helps after trouble. They worked in companionable silence, restoring order to the chaos. Matthew boarded up the broken door as best he could while Sarah coaxed life back into the dying fire. Soon the cabin filled with the comforting scent of coffee, and the warmth began to chase away the December chill. They might come back, Sarah said quietly, staring into the flames. Men like that don't forget being bested. Maybe? Matthew agreed. But Jake won't be drawing a gun for a while, and the others didn't have much spine without him. He paused. Still, might be wise to stay with neighbors for a few days. The nearest neighbors are 5 miles off, and they... She shrugged. A young widow alone causes talk. They've made it clear I'm not welcome unless I'm looking to remarry their eldest son. Matthew understood. The frontier could be unforgiving to women without men's protection, forcing them into choices they might not otherwise make. Well, I'll bed down in the barn tonight, if you've no objection. Make sure they don't circle back. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw her take in his trail-worn appearance, the gun at his hip, the weary kindness in his eyes. You're not just a drifter, are you, Mr. Garrett? Just a man who needed to be somewhere else, he answered, which was truth enough. Sarah nodded slowly. The barn's cold. There's room by the fire, if you don't mind the impropriety. Ma'am, after what you've been through tonight, I reckon propriety can take a back seat to safety. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen from her. Then you're welcome to stay, Mr. Garrett, and thank you. Again. As the night deepened around the little cabin, they sat by the fire, two strangers brought together by violence and chance. Outside, the prairie wind sang its eternal song, but inside, for the moment, there was warmth and safety and the quiet companionship of shared solitude. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as Matthew secured the last board across the damaged door frame. The makeshift barrier wouldn't stop determined men, but it would give warning. He tested it once more, then turned to find Sarah watching him with those green eyes that seemed to hold too much pain for someone so young. It'll hold for tonight, he said, brushing sawdust from his hands. Come morning, I'll do proper repairs. You don't have to, she began, but he cut her off with a gentle gesture. Man can't leave a door hanging broken. Goes against the grain. He moved to warm his hands by the fire, noting how she tensed slightly at his approach. After what she'd endured, he couldn't blame her wariness. I'll keep my bedroll by the door. Anyone tries to come through, they'll have to go over me first. Sarah wrapped a shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the cabin was warming nicely. I should be afraid of you too, she said quietly. A strange man with a gun, quick to violence, but somehow... She trailed off, shaking her head. Sometimes we know who to trust, Matthew offered. Gut feelings kept me alive more than once. She rose to check the coffee pot, her movements still shaky. You said you needed to be somewhere else. Running from something? More like running to nothing in particular. He accepted the tin cup she offered, the coffee black and strong enough to float a horseshoe. Had a life once. Badge, responsibilities, people depending on me. Lost my taste for it. What happened? The question came soft, without pushing. Matthew stared into the fire, seeing other flames, another time. Town I was sheriffing got caught between two cattle outfits feuding over water rights. Tried to keep the peace, enforce the law fair and square. But when rich men want war, they generally get it. He took a long sip of coffee, lost some good people. Decided I was done trying to hold back the tide with a tin star. So you drift. So I drift. He glanced at her. What about you? How'd you end up alone out here? Sarah settled back in her chair, tucking her feet under her skirts. Thomas and I came out from Ohio 3 years ago. He had dreams of farming, making something of this land. We were happy. Her voice caught slightly. The consumption took him in September. Doctor said it was his lungs, weakened from working in the coal mines before we met. Nothing to be done. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't plow fields or mend fences or keep the wolves from the door, literal or otherwise. She gestured around the cabin. I've tried to keep things going, but a woman alone, the bank wants their payments. The neighbors want me married off or gone, and now outlaws know I'm an easy mark. They sat in silence for a while, the wind testing the boards over the door. Matthew found himself studying her in the firelight, the determined set of her jaw despite everything, the capable hands that had fought back against her attackers. She reminded him of the prairie itself, beautiful, resilient, and dangerous to underestimate. Those men, Sarah said suddenly, they knew about me. Someone in town told them about the widow living alone. Matthew nodded grimly. Jake and his crew didn't just stumble on your place. They had information. which means others might come. She set down her cup with a sharp click. I can't stay here. Where would you go? I don't know. The admission seemed to cost her. Back east, maybe. Find work in a factory or as a governess. Anything but this. That what you want? To give up what you and your husband built? Fire flashed in her eyes. What I want is to not be afraid every time I hear hoofbeats. What I want is to work my land without people treating me like I'm either helpless or improper. What I want. She stopped, pressing her palms against her eyes. Forgive me. You don't need to hear my troubles. Sometimes talking helps. Matthew rose to add another log to the fire. And I've got nowhere pressing to be. Sarah laughed, a sound with little humor in it. A drifter and a widow, sharing coffee and sorrows. What would the good people of Cedar Ridge say? From what you've told me, nothing they haven't already said. That earned him a real smile, small but genuine. True enough. She studied him openly now, taking in the wear on his clothes, the careful way he moved, always aware of his surroundings. You could have kept riding. Why didn't you? Matthew considered the question. Why had he stopped? He'd trained himself not to get involved, not to care about other people's troubles. But something about the scene, maybe the way she'd been fighting despite the odds, maybe just the wrongness of it all, had pulled him in. Man can only walk away from so much, he said finally. After a while, it starts to weigh on your soul. The weight of walking away, or the weight of getting involved. Both, I reckon. Sarah stood, moving to the window to peer out at the darkness. They destroyed Thomas's watch. His father gave it to him when he came of age. It was the only thing of value we had, and they just smashed it. Her voice held more grief over that small loss than over her larger ordeal. Things can be replaced. Not that thing. Not what it meant. She turned back to him. Do you have anything like that? Something that holds memory? Matthew's hand went unconsciously to his vest pocket, where his father's compass rested. Tarnished brass. Unreliable needle, but he'd carried it 1,500 miles since leaving home. Maybe? Then you understand. He did. The frontier stripped away so much, comfort, safety, often life itself. The small tokens that connected people to who they'd been, where they'd come from, became precious beyond their worth. I'll help you look for the pieces come morning, he offered. Might be salvageable. You're very kind. Mr. Garrett. Matthew. And I'm not particularly kind. Just know what it's like to lose things. She moved back to the fire, and they rebuilt the conversation along with the flames. Sarah told him about meeting Thomas at a church social, his grand plans for the West, the daily struggles of homesteading. Matthew found himself sharing more than he'd intended, stories from his lawman days, the places he'd seen in his wandering, even a few tales that made her laugh despite everything. The hours passed unmarked except by the settling of logs in the fire. Sarah's eyelids grew heavy, though she fought sleep with the determination of someone afraid to let down their guard. Rest, Matthew told her gently. I'll keep watch. It wouldn't be proper? He smiled slightly. Ma'am, we're past that. You need sleep to face tomorrow. She hesitated, then nodded. There's a quilt in the chest, if you get cold. Sarah curled up in the chair, unwilling to use the bed the outlaws had torn apart. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her, her breathing evening out into sleep. Matthew watched the fire and the door in equal measure, his hand never far from his gun. In sleep, her face lost its guarded expression, revealing the young woman beneath the widow's burden. She murmured once, her late husband's name, and Matthew felt an unexpected twist in his chest. He'd forgotten what it was like to witness such raw grief, such vulnerability. The night stretched on, marked by the wind's howl and the occasional pop from the fire. Matthew's thoughts drifted to roads not taken, choices that had led him to this moment in this cabin with this woman who fought so hard against a world determined to break her. Come dawn, he told himself. He'd help her clean up, fix the door, maybe ride to town for supplies. Then he'd move on, as always. It was safer that way, for both of them. But as he watched her sleep, as he stood guard against the dangers of the night, Matthew felt the first cracks in the walls he'd built around himself. The prairie had a way of stripping things down to their essence, and what he found at his core surprised him. The desire to stay, to protect, to be something more than a ghost drifting between towns. The fire burned lower, and Matthew fed it carefully, maintaining warmth and light against the December cold. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the prairie in pristine white. By morning, their tracks and those of the outlaws would be covered, granting a kind of absolution. But morning was hours away yet, and Matthew Garrett kept his watch, guardian of a stranger who was already becoming something more. Dawn came slowly to the prairie, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pearl and rose. Matthew had dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake at every sound, but the night had passed without incident. Sarah stirred as the first light touched the window, blinking in confusion before memory returned. "You stayed awake all night," she said, noting his red-rimmed eyes and the defensive position he'd maintained by the door. Caught a few winks here and there. Matthew stretched, his joints protesting the hours of vigilance. "Coffee's still warm if you want some." She rose, smoothing her wrinkled dress, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I'm not usually so unguarded with strangers. Nothing usual about yesterday." He gestured toward the window. "Snow's covered the tracks, but that works both ways. If Jake's crew is smart, they're holed up somewhere nursing their wounded pride and their leader's shoulder." Sarah moved to the window, taking in the transformed landscape. "Beautiful," she murmured. Then her expression hardened. "But it won't last. Nothing beautiful does out here. That's a dark view for someone so young. The frontier ages you quick, Mr. Garrett. Matthew." She turned from the window. "I need to check the animals. Make sure those men didn't harm them. I'll come with you." They bundled against the cold and ventured out together. The barn stood intact, and inside they found the old plow horse placidly munching hay, unbothered by the previous night's drama. The chickens clucked irritably at the disturbance, but appeared unharmed. "Thomas bought her at auction," Sarah said, stroking the mare's neck. "Said every farm needed a good horse. Daisy's not much to look at, but she's steady. Steady's worth more than Flash out here." Matthew checked the horse's hooves with practiced hands. "She's in good shape. You've taken care of her." "I've tried to take care of everything." Sarah's voice held a note of exhaustion. "But it's never enough." They worked together in comfortable silence, mucking stalls and scattering feed for the chickens. Matthew found himself impressed by Sarah's efficiency despite her obvious fatigue. She knew her way around a barn, handled tools with competence born of necessity. "You mentioned those men knew about you from someone in town," Matthew said as they finished. "Any idea who might have pointed them your way?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Could be anyone. The banker, Hiram Walsh, has been pressuring me to sell. Says a woman can't manage a homestead. The Hendricks family wants my water rights for their cattle. Even the shopkeeper, Mr. Finch, suggested I'd be better off back east." She laughed bitterly. "Take your pick of who might want me gone badly enough to mention me to outlaws." Back in the cabin, they shared a meager breakfast of hardtack soaked in coffee and the last of Sarah's preserves. Matthew noticed how carefully she portioned everything, making sure he had enough while taking less for herself. "I need to go to town," she said eventually. "Get supplies. Report what happened to whatever law Cedar Ridge pretends to have. I'll ride with you. You don't have to. Those men are still out there. You think they'll hesitate to finish what they started if they catch you alone on the road?" Sarah fell silent, recognizing the truth of it. "I hate this," she said quietly. "Needing protection, being afraid. Thomas and I were partners. Now I'm just the helpless widow everyone expected me to become. Asking for help when you need it isn't weakness, and from what I saw last night, helpless isn't a word I'd use for you." She gave him a searching look. "What would you use?" "Brave, determined." He paused. "Maybe a little too stubborn for your own good." That earned him the ghost of a smile. Thomas used to say the same thing. They prepared for the journey to town, Matthew saddling both horses while Sarah changed into her least damaged dress. When she emerged from behind the curtain she'd strung across one corner for privacy, he saw she'd pinned her hair up properly and tried to hide the rope marks on her wrists with her sleeves. Quite the transformation, he observed. If I'm going to face the gossips of Cedar Ridge, I'll do it with my head high. She lifted her chin as if practicing. Let them whisper about the widow and the drifter. I've survived worse than their opinions. The ride to town took 2 hours through the fresh snow. Matthew rode slightly ahead, alert for trouble, while Sarah followed on Daisy. He found himself glancing back frequently, watching how she sat the horse with quiet dignity despite everything she'd endured. Cedar Ridge appeared like most frontier towns, a main street of false-fronted buildings trying to look more substantial than they were. A church at one end and saloons at the other, with commerce squeezed between morality and vice. People stopped to stare as they rode in, and Matthew could almost hear the rumors starting. The sheriff's office is there. Sarah pointed to a small building with a tarnished star nailed to the door. Though Sheriff Coleman is usually drunk by noon. They tied their horses and entered to find exactly what Matthew expected. A pot-bellied man with a badge dozing at his desk, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and neglect. Sheriff, Sarah said firmly, and the man startled awake. Mrs. McKenna? Coleman blinked owlishly. What brings you to town? 3 men forced their way into my home last night. They robbed me, destroyed my property, and would have done worse if Mr. Garrett hadn't intervened. Coleman's gaze shifted to Matthew, taking in the tied-down gun and travel-worn appearance. And you are? Just a man who happened by at the right time. Happened by? The sheriff's tone held skepticism. Well, did you get a good look at these alleged robbers? Nothing alleged about it, Matthew said evenly. Leader called himself Jake. Bearded, gray eyes, about 6 feet. He'll have a bullet wound in his right shoulder. 2 others with him, one thin and hawk-faced, one younger, nervous type. Coleman made a show of writing this down. Jake Sullivan. Sounds like he and his boys drift through sometimes. I'll keep an eye out. You'll do more than that, Sarah interjected, steel in her voice. You'll form a posse, track them down. Now, Mrs. McKenna. Coleman interrupted with condescending patience. These men are likely long gone. No point stirring up trouble. Maybe this will teach you the danger of living alone so far from town. A young woman like yourself needs protection. The protection of the law should be enough, Matthew observed quietly. Coleman's eyes hardened. And who are you to tell me my business? Drifter? Someone who wore a badge long enough to know when it's being dishonored. The 2 men locked eyes for a long moment before Coleman looked away. I'll make inquiries, he muttered. That's all I can promise. Outside, Sarah's hands shook with suppressed anger. Useless. Worse than useless. Most frontier law is. Matthew agreed. Come on, let's get those supplies. At the general store, they faced more subtle hostility. Finch, the proprietor, made a show of examining Sarah's credit in his ledger while other customers whispered behind their hands. I'm afraid your account is nearly at its limit. Mrs. McKenna, Finch announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Perhaps you should consider Mr. Walsh's offer for your land. Cash would solve many problems. My problems are my own. Mr. Finch. I need flour, coffee, salt pork if you have it, and ammunition. Ammunition? Finch's eyebrows rose. What does a woman need with ammunition? To defend herself when the law won't, Matthew said, stepping forward. The lady's credit good or not? Finch flushed at the implied threat in Matthew's tone. I suppose I can extend. No need. Matthew placed coins on the counter. Cash transaction. Sarah turned to protest, but he shook his head slightly. They completed their purchases under the weight of many stares, loading supplies into Daisy's saddlebags. I'll pay you back, Sarah said as they left the store. No need for that either. I don't accept charity. Not charity, investment. At her puzzled look, He explained, "I figure a place that serves decent coffee deserves to stay in business." As they prepared to leave town, a well-dressed man approached. Walsh, the banker. Matthew guessed from Sarah's sudden tension. "Mrs. McKenna, I heard about your troubles." Walsh oozed false sympathy. "Surely now you see the wisdom of accepting my offer. The frontier is no place for a woman alone. The frontier is no place for vultures either. Yet here you are," Sarah replied sweetly. Walsh's face darkened. "You do well to watch your tongue. I'm trying to help." "By offering half what the land's worth?" Matthew interrupted. "Interesting definition of help. And you are?" "Someone who recognizes a snake when he sees one." Walsh puffed up with indignation. "Sheriff Coleman will hear about this threatening behavior. Good. Tell him Jake Sullivan and his boys are probably drinking in one of those saloons right now, nursing a shoulder wound I gave him. Seems the kind of information a lawman should have." They left Walsh sputtering on the boardwalk and rode out of Cedar Ridge with the weight of many eyes following them. Sarah held her composure until they were well clear of town, then released a shaky breath. "I've never spoken to anyone like that before." "Felt good, didn't it?" "Terrifying," she corrected, then smiled. "But yes, good too." The smile faded. "Though I'll pay for it. Walsh holds my mortgage. Men like Walsh are cowards. Push back hard enough, they usually fold." They rode in companionable silence through the snow-bright afternoon. The supplies secured. Sarah's immediate needs met, but Matthew knew the reprieve was temporary. Jake's gang, Walsh's pressure, the town's judgment, all would return like wolves to a wounded deer. As the cabin came into view, smoke still rising from the chimney he'd banked that morning, Sarah spoke. "How long will you stay?" The question he'd been dreading. "Day or two. Fix that door properly. Make sure you're settled. And then you'll drift on." It wasn't a question, but Matthew answered anyway. "It's what I do." "Yes," Sarah said softly, her face unreadable. "I suppose it is." They unsaddled the horses in silence, each lost in thoughts of impermanence and possibilities unexplored. The sun was already descending toward the horizon, painting the snow crimson and gold. Another night approached, bringing with it new dangers and decisions that would have to be made. But for now, they worked together in the barn, two souls finding unexpected comfort in shared labor and unspoken understanding, while the prairie wind whispered of changes coming with the dawn. The blizzard struck without warning just after nightfall, transforming the prairie into a howling white void. Matthew had just finished reinforcing the cabin door when the first violent gusts hit, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling through every tiny gap in the walls. "It's early for a storm this fierce," Sarah said, peering anxiously through the frost-covered glass. "The animals?" "Already secured them," Matthew assured her. "Moved extra feed into the barn, checked all the latches. They'll weather it fine," as if to challenge his words. The wind rose to a shriek, and the temperature plummeted. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire blazing in the hearth. Sarah added another log, then another. But the cold pressed in from all sides like a living thing. "We'll need to hang blankets over the windows," Matthew said, already moving. "Pack cloth in the gaps. This is fixing to be a bad one." They worked together with practiced efficiency, Sarah producing every spare blanket and piece of fabric while Matthew secured them in place. The howling wind found every weakness in the cabin's construction, and they battled each breach with rags and determination. "Thomas always said the cabin was too drafty," Sarah mentioned as she handed Matthew another strip of cloth. "We plan to think the walls come spring," she trailed off, the unfinished nature of that plan hanging between them. By the time they'd done what they could, both were shivering despite their exertions. The fire seemed a small, brave thing against the storm's fury, casting dancing shadows while providing too little warmth. "We need to conserve wood," Matthew observed, eyeing their dwindling supply. "This storm could last days." Sarah nodded, wrapping herself in a shawl. "There's more in the lean-to, but no one's going out in that. The wind punctuated his words with a gust that shook the entire structure. "We make do with what's inside." They arranged themselves close to the fire, sharing the meager circle of warmth. Matthew noticed Sarah trying to hide her shivers, maintaining distance even as the cold bit deep. "This is foolish," he said quietly. "Body heat's nothing to be ashamed of when survival's at stake." She looked at him for a long moment, propriety warring with practicality in her eyes. Then the cabin shuddered under a particularly fierce gust, and decision was made. They pulled their chairs closer, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and wrapped what blankets they'd kept in a cocoon around them both. "I haven't been this close to anyone since—" Sarah's voice was barely audible over the storm. "I know." Matthew kept his tone carefully neutral, though he was acutely aware of her presence, the lavender scent of her hair mixing with wood smoke. "Just two people trying not to freeze." Minutes passed, marked only by the wind's violence and the fire's crackling defiance. Gradually, shared warmth began to win against the cold. Sarah's shivers subsided, and she relaxed fractionally against his shoulder. "Tell me about somewhere warm," she said suddenly. "Anywhere but here." Matthew searched his memory. "Spent a summer in San Antonio once, so hot the horses barely wanted to move. There was this little cantina near the river, served cold beer and the spiciest food you ever tasted. Owner's daughter would sing in the evenings, voice like honey over hot coals." "Did you court her?" "No," he felt rather than saw her curious glance. "I was wearing a badge then. Figured it wouldn't be fair, starting something I couldn't finish. Always moving on." Sarah murmured, "Don't you ever want to stop? Build something lasting?" "Wanting and doing are different things." The wind screamed agreement, reminding them both how quickly the frontier could tear down what people built. Sarah fell quiet, but he could feel her thinking, weighing words. "Finally, I used to dream about traveling. Thomas and I would talk about it, after the farm was established, after the debts were paid, after. Now I realize after never comes. There's always another season, another struggle." "Where would you have gone?" "San Francisco. I wanted to see the ocean, smell salt air instead of dust and grass." She laughed softly. "Foolish dreams for a farmer's wife." "So, nothing foolish about dreams. They keep us going when everything else fails." The storm intensified, if such a thing were possible. Snow drove horizontal past the windows, and the temperature continued dropping despite their shared warmth. Matthew felt Sarah trembling again. Not from cold alone this time. "The night those men came," she whispered, "when they had me tied, gagged. I couldn't breathe properly, kept thinking I'd suffocate before they decided what to do with me." The helplessness was worse than the fear. Matthew's jaw tightened. "You weren't helpless. You survived. Because you arrived." Another few minutes. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and he felt the dampness of tears. "I can still taste that filthy cloth, feel the ropes cutting in. But you're here now, safe, breathing free." She pulled back enough to look at him, her eyes luminous in the firelight. "Am I safe? Really? You'll leave soon, and they'll come back. If not Jake's gang, then others. The vultures are already circling." He wanted to offer reassurances, promises, but the words wouldn't come. She was right. The frontier offered no safety for a woman alone, only varying degrees of danger. "I'm sorry," she said, sensing his struggle. "It's not your burden to carry." "Maybe I'm tired of deciding what is and isn't my burden." The admission surprised them both. Sarah studied his face as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Slowly, tentatively. She reached up to touch the scar along his jaw, an old reminder of a knife fight in Dodge. "How many times have you nearly died protecting strangers?" "Stopped counting, but you keep doing it. Someone has to—" Her hand lingered against his face, and the air between them shifted, charged with possibility. The storm faded to background noise as they leaned closer, drawn by forces stronger than wind or cold. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, two wounded souls testing unfamiliar ground. Then Sarah made a small sound, part sigh, part sob. and something broke open between them. The kiss deepened, carrying grief and loneliness and desperate hope all at once. When they pulled apart, both breathing unsteadily, Sarah's cheeks were flushed with more than cold. "I shouldn't have." "Why not?" Matthew's voice came rough. "Because of what people might say, because you're supposed to mourn forever, because you're leaving." The words hung crystalline between them. "Because I can't survive losing someone else." He couldn't argue with that logic, but found he wanted to. The walls he'd built, the rules he'd lived by, they seemed suddenly as insubstantial as the snow melting against the windows. "The storm's not going anywhere tonight," he said finally. "Neither am I." Sarah searched his face, then nodded slowly. They settled back into their shared cocoon of warmth. But everything had changed. Where before there had been careful distance, now there was awareness. The rise and fall of shared breathing. The whisper of fabric when either moved. The dangerous comfort of human connection. "Thomas was a good man," Sarah said into the semi-darkness. "Kind, steady, full of dreams. I loved him truly. I know. But he's gone, and I'm still here, still breathing, still feeling, still—" She stopped, struggling for words. "Is it wrong to want to live? Not just survive, but live? Would he want you to stop living?" She considered this. "No, he'd hate seeing me like this, afraid and alone. He always said I was stronger than I knew. Smart man." They talked through the night while the blizzard raged, sharing stories and silences with equal ease. Sarah spoke of her childhood in Ohio, her parents' deaths from fever, meeting Thomas at her lowest point. Matthew found himself telling her things he'd never shared, the weight of every life he'd failed to save, the corrosive nature of violence even in service of law, the moment he'd unpinned his badge and walked away. As dawn approached, gray and reluctant through the storm, exhaustion finally claimed them. They dozed fitfully, still wrapped together for warmth, Sarah's head finding its way to Matthew's shoulder. In sleep, the barriers dropped completely. She curled into him with trust that made his chest tight, while he held her with protective instinct that surprised him with its fierceness. The fire burned low, needing attention, but Matthew couldn't bring himself to move. Outside, the blizzard showed signs of weakening, though snow still fell heavily. Soon, the storm would pass. Decisions would need making. The world would intrude with all its dangers and demands. But for now, in this stolen moment between night and day, between storm and calm, they simply held each other. Two lost souls finding unexpected shelter from more than just the cold. And if such comfort was temporary, if heartbreak waited inevitable as spring, they chose not to think of it. The prairie would demand its due, as it always did. But not yet, not in this breath between storms, where warmth meant more than fire and safety transcended mere survival. The storm broke near noon, leaving behind a world transformed by white drifts and deadly cold. Matthew ventured out first, fighting through waist-deep snow to check the barn. The animals had survived, huddled together for warmth, but the path between buildings was nearly impassable. "We'll need to dig out," he told Sarah when he returned, shaking snow from his coat. "But first, I want to scout the perimeter. Fresh snow shows tracks clear as day." She nodded, understanding his caution. While he'd been outside, she'd rebuilt the fire and started preparing what food they had. The easy intimacy of the night before had given way to careful distance, both of them uncertain how to navigate this new territory between them. Matthew strapped on his gun and took Thomas's old rifle from above the mantel. "Bar the door behind me. I won't be long." The world outside was pristine and treacherous, snow masking familiar landmarks and creating new dangers. He moved carefully, reading the landscape with eyes trained by years of tracking. Near the tree line, he found what he'd feared. Horse tracks, partially filled but still visible. 3 riders had circled the property during the storm, staying just out of sight. Jake's boys, or others drawn by news of a vulnerable widow. Either way, trouble was closing in. He was examining the tracks more closely when he heard it, the crack of a rifle. snow exploding from the tree beside his head. Matthew dove behind a drift as another shot followed. Then another. Pinned down. 50 yards from the cabin. He cursed his carelessness. "That's far enough, lawman." Jake Sullivan's voice carried across the snow, rough with pain and anger. "Thought we'd find you here, playing protector." Matthew risked a glance. 3 figures moved through the trees, Jake favoring his wounded shoulder. His 2 companions spread wide for better angles. They'd waited out the storm, then circled back. He'd underestimated their determination. "Smart of you to wait," Matthew called back. "Buying time while calculating distances and cover, but not smart enough to leave when you had the chance." Jake laughed harshly. "You cost me blood, drifter. That demands payment. The woman's just a bonus now." Another rifle shot. Closer this time. They were trying to flank him. Matthew fired back, forcing one figure to dive for cover. But his position was poor. The cabin seemed impossibly distant across the open snow. Then, unexpectedly, a shot rang out from the cabin itself. Sarah had opened the shuttered window, Thomas's rifle barrel protruding. Her shot went wide, but it forced Jake's men to reconsider their approach. "Get inside," Matthew shouted. But Sarah held her position, firing again with more accuracy. The crossfire gave him the opening he needed. He burst from cover, running hard through the deep snow while firing at the scattered outlaws. Jake tried to track him, but his wounded shoulder threw off his aim. The thin man rose to shoot, and Sarah's rifle cracked again, sending him spinning into a snowbank. 20 yards. 10. Matthew could hear Jake cursing. See the younger outlaw trying to circle behind? Then his foot caught a buried root, and he went down hard. The wind knocked from his lungs. He rolled desperately as Jake's shot fountained snow inches from his head. Sarah's rifle spoke once more, and Jake howled. Clutching his leg, the remaining outlaw, seeing their leader down and his partner unmoving in the snow, broke and ran for the horses. Matthew gained his feet and stumbled the last few yards to the cabin. Sarah hauled him inside, both of them breathing hard, ears ringing from gunfire. Through the window, they watched the young outlaw help Jake onto a horse, the wounded leader clutching both shoulder and leg now. "This ain't over," Jake screamed across the distance. "You hear me? I'll see you both dead." But the threat rang hollow from a man who could barely stay in the saddle. They disappeared into the trees, leaving only churned snow and a still figure in the drift. The thin man, who wouldn't be threatening anyone again. Sarah lowered the rifle with shaking hands. "Is he dead or close to it?" Matthew checked his own weapons, reloading with practiced efficiency. "You saved my life. I couldn't just watch them kill you." She sank into a chair, the weight of what had happened settling over her. "I've never shot at a person before, never wanted to hurt anyone. Sometimes we don't get a choice." He knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "You did what you had to do, what Thomas would have done to protect what's his." "But I'm not Thomas." The words burst out, full of anguish. "I'm not brave or strong or... You just faced down 3 armed men to protect someone you've known 2 days. Don't tell me you're not brave." His grip tightened on her hands. "Sarah, you've got more courage than half the lawmen I've known. You just haven't had to use it before." She looked at him through tears, and something shifted in her expression. Before he could react, she leaned forward and kissed him fierce and desperate, tasting of gunpowder and survival. When she pulled back, her eyes blazed with newfound determination. "They'll be back," she said. "Jake won't let this stand." "No, he won't. But he's hurt bad now, and down to 1 man. They'll need to regroup, maybe find more guns." Matthew stood, pulling her up with him. "We've got a small window. Need to decide what to do." "We?" Sarah studied his face. "I thought you'd be riding out after this. 1 gunfight's more than you bargained for." The accusation stung because it should have been true. The Matthew Garrett of a week ago would already be saddling Belle, putting distance between himself and this complication. But that man hadn't watched Sarah McKenna face down outlaws with steady hands and fierce heart. Maybe I'm tired of riding out, he said quietly. She searched his eyes for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we'd better prepare. If they're coming back, we'll be ready. They spent the afternoon transforming the cabin into a defensible position. Matthew showed Sarah how to load quickly, where to position herself for best cover. They dragged the dead outlaw away from the house, grim work that Sarah faced without flinching. The body would freeze solid before they could bury it properly, but at least it was out of sight. As they worked, they talked strategy. The cabin's position was good, clear sight lines, minimal cover for attackers, but they were low on ammunition, and Jake might bring more men next time. We could ride for town, Sarah suggested while they reinforced the shutters. Stay at the hotel until what? Jake decides to burn this place down? Matthew shook his head. Besides, would town really protect you? From what I've seen, they'd just as soon see you gone. She knew he was right. Cedar Ridge would offer no real sanctuary, just different dangers. Then we make our stand here. He tested the word, found it fit better than expected. You sure about that? This isn't your fight alone anymore. Hasn't been since you walked through that door. Sarah paused in her work, studying him. Why did you? Really? You could have kept riding when you saw trouble. Matthew considered the question, wanting to give her truth. First time I walked away from someone in trouble, it was a family outside Wichita. Told myself it wasn't my problem, wasn't my job anymore. Found out later road agents killed them all. Man, woman, 2 kids. I've been seeing their faces every mile since. So you stopped for them, not me. Started that way, he admitted. But somewhere between cutting your ropes and sharing coffee, it became about you. He met her eyes steadily. Still is. Sarah moved closer, reaching up to touch his face as she had the night before. I've known you 3 days. Matthew Garrett, how is it you already mean this much? Same way you went from stranger to someone I'd die protecting. He covered her hand with his. The frontier strips things down to essence. We recognize what matters because we can't afford not to. She rose on her toes and kissed him again. Softer this time, but no less meaningful. When they parted, her smile held equal parts sadness and hope. Then we'd better survive this. I'd hate to finally find something worth having just to lose it to Jake Sullivan's wounded pride. They finished their preparations as the sun declined toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of amber and rose. The beauty of it mocked the violence of the day, the blood frozen in the snow. That night, they took turns keeping watch, though both knew sleep would be elusive. The kiss of afternoon had opened a door neither could close, and the awareness hummed between them like telegraph wire. But they maintained careful distance, understanding that what was growing between them needed time they might not have. Tell me about after, Sarah said during her watch. Matthew dozing fitfully nearby. When this is over, when Jake's dealt with. What then? He opened his eyes, studying her profile in the moonlight. Depends. On whether you still need a hired hand come spring. Seems like this place could use someone who knows horses. Can handle a plow. Is that what you're applying for? Hired hand. To start, he said carefully. Man's got to prove himself useful before he presumes anything more. Sarah turned to face him fully. And if I said you've already proven yourself? Then I'd say you deserve better than a broken-down ex-lawman with more past than future. Maybe I'm not looking for perfect. Maybe I'm looking for someone who understands loss, who chooses to stay when leaving would be easier. She paused, gathering courage. Maybe I'm looking for you. Before he could respond, a sound carried on the night wind. Horses, distant but approaching. They both tensed, reaching for weapons, the moment shattered by returning danger. But this time, they faced it together. 2 souls forged by prairie wind and desperate courage into something stronger than either alone. Whatever came with dawn, they would meet it side by side. The riders weren't Jake's men. As they drew closer, Matthew recognized Sheriff Coleman's bulky form, accompanied by 2 deputies and, surprisingly, several townspeople, including the banker Walsh. They reined up outside the cabin as dawn broke gray and cold over the prairie. "Mrs. McKenna! Matthew Garrett!" Coleman called out, his voice carrying an official weight it had lacked in town. "Need to speak with you both." Matthew and Sarah exchanged wary glances before stepping onto the porch, weapons lowered but ready. The sheriff's gaze took in their defensive positions, the reinforced shutters, and lingered on the dark stain in the snow where the thin outlaw had fallen. "Bit early for social calls, Sheriff," Matthew observed. Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Jake Sullivan rode into town near midnight, bleeding bad and raving about murder. Says you two ambushed his party unprovoked, killed Bart Hensley, wounded Jake Grievous." "That's a lie." Sarah stepped forward, anger flashing in her eyes. "They came here hunting us. We defended ourselves." "So you say," Walsh interjected, his thin face showing satisfaction. "But a young widow and a drifter, killing a man, wounding another, sounds like there's more to this story." One of the townsmen, the shopkeeper Finch, cleared his throat. "Jake's telling anyone who'll listen that you two are in league together. Says the drifter's been hiding out here, that the whole widow act is just cover for—" He trailed off, glancing uncomfortably at Sarah. "For what, Mr. Finch?" Sarah's voice could have cut glass. "Please, share what filth Jake Sullivan is spreading about me now." Coleman raised a hand for quiet. "Point is, there's been killing done. That requires investigation. You'll both need to come to town, answer questions proper-like." "And if we refuse?" Matthew asked quietly. The deputies shifted nervously, hands moving toward their guns. Coleman's face hardened. "Then we got a problem. I may not be much, Garrett, but I am the law here. Don't make this worse." Sarah touched Matthew's arm lightly. "We'll come. We have nothing to hide." "Sarah," he began, but she shook her head. "They need to hear the truth, all of it." She faced the assembled men squarely. 3 nights ago, Jake Sullivan and 2 others forced their way into my home. They bound and gagged me, ransacked my house, and made clear their intentions. Mr. Garrett arrived by Providence and drove them off, wounding Jake in the process. Yesterday, they returned seeking revenge. We defended ourselves. That's the whole truth, and I'll swear to it before God and man. Convenient story," Walsh muttered. "A mysterious stranger appears just in time to save you. Sounds like a dime novel." "Would you prefer I'd been murdered, Mr. Walsh?" Sarah's question rang across the snow. "Would that have been more convenient for your plans to buy my land?" The banker's face flushed, but before he could respond, one of the younger townsmen spoke up. "I seen her rope burns myself when she came to town. Saw how shook she was. And Jake's been bragging for weeks about easy pickings out here," another added reluctantly. "Said the widow had money hidden." Coleman looked uncomfortable as the tide of opinion shifted. "Still need to do this proper. You'll come peaceful." Matthew nodded slowly. "We'll come, but the lady rides her own horse, and I keep my guns. You're hardly in a position to make demands," Walsh began. But Coleman cut him off. "Fair enough. Let's get moving. Storm's blown out, but there's weather coming again." They prepared quickly, Sarah changing into her best remaining dress while Matthew saddled the horses. As they worked, he spoke low and urgent. "This could be a trap. Jake's got friends, and that jail won't hold if a mob forms." "I know." Sarah checked the small derringer he'd given her, tucking it into her boot. "But running makes us look guilty. Besides, some of those men looked uncertain. Maybe the truth will matter." The ride to town took on the quality of a parade, their escort drawing attention from every homestead they passed. By the time they reached Cedar Ridge, half the town had gathered on Main Street, drawn by curiosity and the scent of scandal. Jake Sullivan sat on the doctor's porch, his shoulder and leg bandaged, playing the wounded victim to perfection. "There they are," he shouted as they approached. "The murderers shot down poor Bart in cold blood." "After you attacked us," Sarah fired back. "After you broke into my home, terrorized me." "Lies!" Jake struggled to his feet. I was checking on the widow, neighborly-like. This gunman opened fire without warning. The crowd murmured, divided. Matthew saw faces he recognized from the saloon. Jake's drinking companions, but also others. Women who'd lost husbands. Men who'd fought off claim jumpers. The frontier knew the difference between predator and prey, even if it didn't always choose to act on that knowledge. Coleman dismounted heavily. Everyone calm down. We'll sort this out proper. He gestured to the jail. Mrs. McKenna, Mr. Garrett, inside please. The jail was small. Just 2 cells in Coleman's office. The sheriff looked deeply uncomfortable as he faced them across his desk. This is a mess, he admitted quietly. Jake's got friends, but killing a woman don't sit right with most folks. They're waiting to see which way the wind blows. Then tell them the truth, Sarah insisted. You know Jake's character. You know what he's capable of. What I know and what I can prove are different things. Coleman rubbed his face tiredly. But there might be a way through this. We're listening, Matthew said. Jake wants justice for Bart. Blood for blood, he says. But what he really wants is your land. Mrs. McKenna always has. The sheriff glanced at the door, lowering his voice. If you were to sell, leave town quiet like, this could all go away. Sell to who? Sarah's voice dripped contempt. Walsh? Jake himself? Which vulture do I feed to save my life? It's not ideal. It's extortion. Matthew slammed his hand on the desk. You're supposed to uphold the law, not auction it off. Coleman's face reddened. Easy for you to judge. Drifter. You'll ride on when this is done. I have to live here. Keep some kind of peace. Sometimes that means compromise. Sometimes it means standing up, Matthew countered. You wore that badge willing enough. Time to honor it. Before Coleman could respond, shouting erupted outside. Through the window, they could see a crowd gathering, Jake at its center, working them up with gestures and heated words. Justice, someone yelled. Bart deserves justice. The woman's been nothing but trouble since her husband died. Probably killed him too. Sarah went pale at that. Matthew moved closer protectively as the ugly mood outside intensified. Then, unexpectedly, a clear voice cut through the noise. That's enough! The crowd parted to reveal Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, the minister's wife, flanked by several other women from town. She marched up to Jake with the righteous fury of someone who'd held her tongue too long. Jake Sullivan, you're a liar and worse, she declared loudly. Everyone here knows what you are. We've all seen how you look at our daughters, heard your drunken boasts. She turned to address the crowd. Sarah McKenna is a good Christian woman who's suffered enough. If we let her be railroaded by the likes of him, what does that make us? Lizzie's right, another woman called out. I saw those rope marks myself. No decent man does that to a woman. The mood began to shift. Men who'd been ready to form a mob found themselves facing their wives' disapproval. Jake sensed it too, his face darkening with rage. You'd take her word over mine? A widow who takes up with the first drifter to come along? Better a protector than a predator. Mrs. Morrison shot back. And from what I hear, Mr. Garrett showed more Christian charity in one night than you have in your whole miserable life. Matthew felt Sarah's hand slip into his, squeezing tightly as the crowd wrestled with itself. This was the frontier's justice. Messy, personal, driven as much by emotion as evidence. Finally, Coleman emerged from the jail, having found his backbone at last. Here's what's going to happen, he announced. There'll be a proper inquest tomorrow. Judge Carter's riding circuit, due in by morning. Until then, Mrs. McKenna and Mr. Garrett are free on their own recognizance. You can't, Jake began, but Coleman cut him off. I can and I will. Bart Hensley died attacking their home. That's self-defense in any man's book. He fixed Jake with a hard stare. You want to pursue this? That's your right. But I'll be investigating your activities too. Starting with where you got the idea Mrs. McKenna had money hidden. The threat was clear. Jake had accomplices in town. People who'd fed him information, If Coleman started digging, others might be implicated. Walsh was the first to break. "Perhaps we're being hasty," the banker said smoothly. "After all, frontier justice can be rough. If Mrs. McKenna acted in self-defense." The crowd began to disperse, the momentum broken. Jake stood abandoned except for his remaining companion, fury and pain warring on his face. "This ain't over," he snarled at Sarah. "Your husband's luck ran out. Yours will too." Matthew stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "You come near her again, Sullivan, and you'll join your friend Bart. That's not a threat, it's a promise." They locked eyes for a long moment before Jake turned away, limping toward the saloon with his last ally. The immediate crisis had passed, but everyone knew it was only a reprieve. Mrs. Morrison approached as they prepared to leave. "You've made an enemy today. Both of you. Jake won't forget. Neither will we." Sarah replied firmly, "Thank you for speaking up. It took courage." The older woman smiled sadly. "I've buried 2 husbands out here. Dear, I know what wolves look like when they circle. You watch yourself." She glanced at Matthew. "Both of you." As they rode out of town, Sarah was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "They'll never really accept us, will they? Even if Jake backs down, even if we win tomorrow, I'll always be the scandalous widow who took up with a drifter." "Does it matter?" Matthew asked. "What they think?" She considered this. "It used to. Now." She straightened in her saddle. "Now I just want to live my life on my own terms." "Is that so wrong?" "Not wrong at all." He assured her. "Question is, what are those terms?" Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw decision crystallize in her eyes. "Come spring, I want to plant again. Work this land Thomas and I claimed. Build something lasting." She paused. "With you, if you're willing." The words hung between them like a prayer. Matthew thought of all the towns he'd drifted through, all the connections he'd avoided, all the life he'd refused to live. Then he thought of Sarah facing down outlaws with steady hands, challenging the town's hypocrisy, choosing hope over fear. "I'm willing," he said simply. Her smile was answer enough. They rode home through the winter afternoon. 2 souls who'd found each other in the vast loneliness of the prairie. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. The inquest, Jake's lingering threat, the town's judgment. But today, they had this, a decision made, a future chosen, a partnership forged in conflict and sealed in trust. The cabin came into view as the sun began its descent, and Sarah reined up suddenly. "Look," she whispered. There on the porch sat a small bundle, her preserves, returned. With a note, Matthew retrieved it, reading aloud, "From those who remember Christian kindness, E.M." Sarah's eyes misted. Not completely alone, after all. "Never were," Matthew replied. "Just took a while for folks to remember their better angels." They unsaddled the horses in companionable silence, the simple domestic task taking on new meaning. This was how it would be, Matthew realized. Working together, facing whatever came, building something worth defending. As they entered the cabin, Sarah turned to him. "Welcome home, Matthew Garrett." Home. The word settled into his chest like a key finding its lock. After years of drifting, he'd finally found something worth stopping for. Not just a place, but a person brave enough to match his broken pieces with her own. Home, he agreed, and meant it. Spring came slowly to the Kansas prairie, first in the softening of the wind, then in patches of brown showing through melting snow. Matthew stood in the doorway of the barn, watching Sarah scatter seed in the garden plot they'd cleared together. 3 months had passed since the inquest cleared them of wrongdoing. 3 months of building something neither had dared name at first. Judge Carter had been fair, listening to testimony from both sides before ruling that Bart Hensley had died while committing a crime. Jake Sullivan had left town that same day, his threats hanging in the air like smoke, but he hadn't returned. Some said he'd headed south to Mexico. Others claimed he'd died of infection from his wounds. Matthew didn't care, as long as he stayed gone. "You're wool gathering again," Sarah called, smiling as she straightened from her planting. Dirt streaked her face, and her hair had come loose from its pins. But Matthew thought she'd never looked more beautiful. "Just thinking how different things are," he admitted, joining her in the garden. "This time last year, I was sleeping under stars in Arizona, convinced I'd never settle anywhere. And now I can't imagine being anywhere else." She reached up to brush dust from his shoulder, the gesture intimate and familiar. They'd been careful at first, mindful of propriety and her still fresh grief. But as winter gave way to spring, as they worked side by side to repair and improve the homestead, something had grown between them as natural as the seeds they planted. "The minister's coming to dinner Sunday," Sarah mentioned casually. "Mrs. Morrison, too." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "Social call?" "Perhaps." She busied herself with the seed packets, not meeting his eyes. "Or perhaps I mentioned we might have need of his services soon." He stilled, studying her profile. "Sarah, I know it's only been 6 months since Thomas died," she said in a rush. "I know people will talk, say it's too soon, that I'm—" Matthew turned her to face him, cupping her dirt-smudged face gently. "Do you care what they say?" "No." The word came firm and certain. "I loved Thomas, mourned him properly. But I'm alive. Matthew, my heart didn't stop beating with his, and somewhere between that awful night and now, I fell in love with you." The words hung between them like morning glory vines, delicate but strong. Matthew had felt it happening, fought it at first out of respect for her loss and his own fears. But Sarah McKenna was a force of nature, and loving her had become as essential as breathing. "I love you too," he said simply. "Have for a while now." Her smile bloomed like the first flowers of spring. "Then let them talk. We've faced down outlaws and storms and the judgment of the town. What's a little more gossip?" He kissed her there in the garden, tasting earth and promise and the future they were planting together. When they parted, both were grinning like youngsters. "So, the minister's coming to dinner," he mused. "Reckon I should shave, wear my good shirt." "You only have 2 shirts, Matthew." "Then definitely the good one." They laughed together, the sound carrying across the prairie like bird song. It had been a hard winter, but they'd survived it. More than survived. They'd thrived, turning a house of sorrow into a home of hope. As they walked back to the cabin, Sarah's hand in his, she paused suddenly. "Do you ever regret it? Stopping that night?" Matthew considered the question seriously. His old life seemed like a dream now. The endless riding, the careful distance from others, the weight of old failures. Here, with dirt under his nails and Sarah by his side, he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. "Only regret is not stopping sooner," he said finally. "Might have saved us both some pain. Or we might not have been ready." Sarah countered. "Sometimes the right thing comes at the right time, even if it arrives through darkness." They reached the cabin to find a rider approaching, not a threat this time, but young William Morrison, the minister's son, with a telegram. "Came through this morning," he explained, handing it to Matthew. "From California." Matthew read it twice, his expression unreadable. Sarah waited patiently until he handed her the paper. "My brother," he explained. "I wrote him after I decided to stay. He owns a horse ranch near Sacramento. Wants to know if we'd be interested in breeding stock." Sarah's eyes widened. "California? But the farm?" "Could sell for enough to start fresh," Matthew said carefully. "Your dream of seeing the ocean, remember?" She looked at the telegram, then at the cabin they'd fought so hard to defend, the garden they'd just planted, the life they'd built from ruins. "This was Thomas's dream," she said slowly. "The farm, Kansas, all of it. I made it mine out of loyalty, out of having nowhere else to go. And now—" Sarah walked to the window, gazing out at the endless prairie. "Now I have somewhere to go, someone to go with." She turned back, eyes bright with possibility. "Yes, let's go to California. Let's chase a new dream together." Matthew caught her up in his arms. spinning her around the small cabin that had sheltered them through so much. They were laughing, crying, planning all at once, which crops to harvest first for travel money, what to take and what to leave, when to start the journey west. After the wedding, Sarah insisted. I'll not arrive in California as anything but Mrs. Matthew Garrett, proper and legal. Wouldn't have it any other way, he agreed. Though folks might wonder why you're taking up with a worn-out former lawman with more scars than sense. She traced the line of his jaw, the old knife scar that marked him. Because that worn-out lawman gave me back my life, reminded me that breathing isn't just about survival. It's about living, loving, choosing joy even after sorrow. Sunday came bright and clear. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony in the garden they'd planted together, with Mrs. Morrison and Sheriff Coleman as witnesses. Even some townspeople came, won over by the quiet dignity of their love. Sarah wore her mother's dress, altered to fit. With early wildflowers in her hair, Matthew had indeed shaved and worn his good shirt, looking uncomfortable but determined in his happiness. Do you, Sarah McKenna, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? The minister asked. I do, she answered, strong and certain. Do you, Matthew Garrett, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of all his wandering years finding their destination. When they kissed as husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in applause. Even Sheriff Coleman was seen wiping his eyes, though he'd deny it later. The celebration was simple. Food shared in the garden, stories told, goodwill flowing like water after drought, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in familiar shades of crimson and gold. The guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone. No regrets? Matthew asked as they stood on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear into distance. None, Sarah assured him. Though I do have one request. Anything. She smiled. That mix of mischief and steel that had captured him from the start. When we get to California, I want to learn to shoot properly and ride like you do. If I'm going to be a rancher's wife, I should know the trade. Matthew laughed, pulling her close. I'll teach you everything I know. Though seems to me you've already got the important parts down. Courage, determination, and a steady hand when it counts. They went inside their home, soon to be someone else's, but carrying with them the memories that had made it theirs. In the morning, they'd start preparing for the journey west, toward ocean breezes and new possibilities. But tonight was for celebrating survival, love, and the unexpected ways life could bloom even in the harshest ground. As spring deepened toward summer, Matthew and Sarah Garrett set their faces toward the setting sun, ready for whatever adventures awaited. The prairie had tested them with violence and loss, but it had also given them each other. Now they would write a new chapter, not as widow and drifter, but as partners bonded by choice and strengthened by trial. Behind them, the cabin stood empty but not abandoned, waiting for the next dreamers brave enough to claim it. And somewhere in the vast grasslands, the wind carried whispers of their story, how a desperate night had led to lasting love, how courage could grow from fear, how sometimes the best journeys were the ones that brought you home to someone who'd been waiting all along. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but no longer empty. For Matthew and Sarah, it had become the crucible that forged two broken hearts into one strong whole, ready to face whatever horizons beckoned with hope instead of mere survival. After all the fear and binding ropes, after the moments when breath seemed stolen forever, love had given them both back their wind, and with it, wings to soar toward dreams neither had dared imagine alone. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'm curious, where in the world are you enjoying this tale? Please share in the comments below where you're listening from so we can connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Sarah and Matthew's journey. Did their love story touch your heart? Let me know what you think.